In this video, I want to show you all promising underdogs, the best inexpensive favorites, and the best bets to consider for this weekend. I'll also provide my final probability for each fighter's victory, along with their stat differentials. If you find this informative, helpful, or entertaining, please like and subscribe. It really helps keep me motivated to create these videos for you all. I've also added my Patreon information in the description if you want to support me there. There's a $10 a month contribution tier and a $20 a month premium tier. The premium tier gives you early access to all of the analysis and results from my videos, along with the additional data analysis and stats. This includes my prediction model results, fighter history, stat overviews, promising underdogs, best inexpensive favorites, prop bets to consider, and deep dives into each fighter's record and historical fights. So you'll get to see their strengths, their weaknesses, their consistency across different stats, and their stat comparisons versus all of their historical opponents' averages. All of this combined will help you with your picks and bets. There's a $20 a month tier, which is around $5 per event, and you can also purchase each of these separately, but the membership is cheaper and easier. Plus, you're directly helping with the improvement and expansion of the content for this channel. Running this data, analysis, and prediction models takes hours every day and week, so I'd greatly appreciate any support that you can show. And thank you to everyone who has shown me support recently. Also, if you like detailed breakdowns and predictions, I do those weekly for full cards as well, including prelim fights, so feel free to check those out on my channel. Let's go ahead and jump right in. First, let's take a look at promising underdogs. The fighters' names are on the leftmost column, followed by their probability of victory that I presented in the prediction video from earlier this week. These probabilities are not only based on several data science prediction models that are trained for accuracy, but also on qualitative information such as the fighter's momentum, their recent performances, their career's trajectory, psychological factors, their training camps, their weight cuts, and any other available information out there. I've also provided the stat advantages for each fighter compared to their opponent, excluding differentials where one of the fighters has a 0 in their stats in order to avoid misleading information. So without further ado, let's get excited for UFC 308, guys. So the first promising underdog that I want to highlight for you guys is none other than Max Blessed Holloway. Max Holloway, he has a height advantage of 4 inches in this matchup. He lands 2.77 more strikes per minute, and he is 2% more accurate than Topuria. Now, all things considered, I gave Max Holloway about a 44% probability of victory, and that's after looking at all the stats, running him through 7 of my data science prediction models, and doing a ton of research outside of the stats alone, and looking at the strengths and weaknesses and fight film studying of both of these gentlemen. So before I get into all the intangibles that I really like about Max Holloway that make him a really good underdog, and honestly, I'm surprised he is an underdog in this matchup, but I guess because he's lost to Alexander Volkanovski a couple times, and Topuria is coming off of a knockout victory over Alexander Volkanovski, then in terms of odds maker MMA math, which isn't always the best thing on the planet, by that logic, they're expecting Topuria to win. But I'm going to make a case for Max Holloway here because I'm trying to show you guys some opportunities. First thing I want to talk about is this guy's record. So just to recap, Max Holloway, he's won 26 fights total. He's finished about 54% of them, but he's very versatile. He's either knocking guys out or he's controlling fights very well. Now, in terms of the UFC, and this might shock you a little bit, he's had 29 fights within the UFC, of which he's won 22. 22 out of 29 fights he's won within the UFC alone. Recently, he's won 4 of his last fights, and he's coming off of 3 back-to-back-to-back victories. This guy has one extremely stacked resume. He's faced just about everybody. He faced Dustin Poirier in 2012. He did lose to him, full disclaimer, but still good experience. He faced Conor McGregor in 2013. He was extremely young. He did end up losing to Conor McGregor. He would go on to face guys like Andre Philly and get that victory via submission. And fast forward a little bit, in 2015, he faced Charles Oliveira and Jeremy Stephens, defeating both of those guys. In 2016, he defeated Anthony Pettis. That was huge. 2017, he defeated Jose Aldo twice. That was very huge. Then he would go on to defeat Brian Ortega very convincingly. Dustin Poirier in 2019, Frankie Edgar in 2019. Then it was the sort of pullback of Max Holloway, and I use pullback in terms of stock market lingo, right? A stock's been going up for a while, has a minor pullback, and then it follows the trend. It continues the trend. So here's why I say that. In 2019 and 2020, he faced Alexander Volkanovski. He lost to him in both of those fights. The first fight in 2019, it was a unanimous decision victory where Volkanovski won and defeated him for the championship. Then Alexander Volkanovski defended his championship and he got a split decision victory back in 2020. So then Max Holloway would learn from that defeat, piece himself together, face Calvin Kattar and win that fight, Then he faced Yair Rodriguez and he won that fight. And at this point, we were kind of thinking that he's not much of a knockout artist or anything. And just keep that in your back pocket for a second. Come 2022, he faced Alexander Volkanovski again, only to lose by him via unanimous decision, unfortunately, and that was a title fight, so he couldn't get that. But then, fast forward to today, finally, I hope you're still with me, he faced Arnold Allen, he faced the Korean Zombie, and then he faced Justin Gaethje. Arnold Allen, he beat him via unanimous decision. That was back in 2023. And then August of 2023, later that year, he defeated the Korean Zombie. He knocked him out in the third round. That was huge. And then, of course, can we not forget the Justin Gaethje fight where he pretty much just outclassed Justin Gaethje the entire fight. And then towards the end of the fight, maybe 10 seconds left, he points to the middle of the octagon in probably one of the most memorable moments ever that we're ever going to get in the UFC. Insanely entertaining moment. And then they just swing at each other, and he ends up knocking out Justin Gaethje. So proving to us all that this guy does still have the knockout power to get the job done. So I just really want to stress his resume here, because when we look at the guys and who he's fought versus who Topuria has fought, it's important to recognize that Max Holloway has challenged himself a lot more. Granted, he's had a longer time to do so, but he has been, he's more experienced is all I'm trying to say. And I'm saying this all before I get into the actual intangibles that I like about Max Holloway, but I really wanted to stress that point because that context is key. You don't just want to choose a guy that's riding off momentum. You actually want to look at experience and take that into account as well. And that's what makes Max Holloway, it positions him to being a really good underdog on this card. So that's my first point as to why Max Holloway makes a good underdog here. Now, with that experience, of course, comes a lot of composure as a fighter and just having an effective game plan and being very adaptive overall. But here's the thing. If Max Holloway can survive the early rounds, which Topuria, I mean, he's known for that early power and his finishing ability, and he puts that pressure on very early. If Holloway can kind of avoid taking that big damage in those first couple rounds, I think there's a really, really good chance, logically, statistically, and stylistically, for Max Holloway to start taking over the fight as the fight goes on and on. And so then, at that point, he can push kind of a higher pace, I'm talking about Holloway, of course, alongside that incredible cardio and volume striking that he has. And by using that relentless pace, I think he can kind of wear down Topuria over those next few rounds while taking it into those championship rounds, round 4 and 5, of course. I also want to say Max Holloway has some of the best boxing skills in terms of MMA. I mean, I'm not saying that he's the greatest boxer of all time, of course. If you understand both sports, you know that they're very different. But in MMA, Max Holloway is one hell of a boxer, if I'm being honest. And so now Topuria is a skilled striker, so don't get me wrong here, but Holloway's boxing is a little bit more polished overall, and I say a little bit respectfully. It's definitely more polished. Topuria is accurate, I'll give him that. He's precise with his shots, but Holloway, if you just observe him in his flow, he's very, very good. And so if he uses that crisp technique, he could outpoint Topuria, and of course the experience really complements that. Now, if he also works Topuria's body and kind of lands those body shots that Max does very well, then that could kind of wear Topuria down as well and kind of diminish his power overall as the fight continues to progress. Now, what he needs to do for sure is kind of defend some takedowns, use that takedown defense, keep the fight standing, keep the fight at range, weather the storm early on. He's very durable as a fighter. He's been tested plenty of times against very hard hitters that probably hit harder than Topuria. I mean, I don't want to say that Justin Gaethje guarantees hit harder than Topuria does, but I will say that Justin Gaethje, when he fights guys, it looks like they got hit with a freaking baseball bat if you take a look at their face. I mean, now Topuria, he hits hard as well. He's a knockout artist, I understand, but my point is this. Max Holloway has proven his durability, and that is a key thing against a guy with a style like Topuria's. I hope you understand what I'm saying. I will also say, obviously, there's a physical advantage for Holloway here, so there's a very, very strong case. If you are going for Holloway, I mean, I don't blame you one bit. This fight could pretty much be 50-50 going into it. Now, there's pros and cons to both guys, and why you might think one will win and the other, and there's only one way to find out, and that's on Saturday. But the point is this: if you're looking for value, Holloway makes a great case for himself as a value bet here. Honestly, part of me is a little bit shocked that he is the underdog. I mean, if anything, they should probably be split or very close to even, but the odds makers, I think they're sleeping a little bit on Holloway. Point being, I think Holloway has a very good chance of getting this done. I probably spent way too much time talking about that last fight, but you know what? No regrets, guys. We're doing a deep dive, and I'm giving you guys all the info and research that I could find. And besides, this card is one to talk about. It's probably one of the best cards of 2024, and I know a lot of you guys are probably thinking, what about UFC 300? I understand. UFC 300 is like once in a decade type of card. But in general, as a regular pay-per-view, this pay-per-view is going to be a banger, guaranteed. So without further ado, the next promising underdog that I want to highlight for you guys is Robert Whittaker, and that's with no surprise, I hope. Robert Whittaker, he absorbs a little bit less strikes per minute than his opponent here, Khamzat Chimaev, and he also has a 17% higher striking defense, which is pretty key. Robert Whittaker's striking is very underrated. I don't think it gets talked about enough, and it's because on paper it doesn't look the best. You could tell that, I mean, on paper, Khamzat has better striking advantages than Whittaker, although stylistically, I could definitely make an argument that Whittaker is the better striker. So Whittaker absorbs 3.44 strikes per minute, and he deflects 59% of those. Now Chimaev, he absorbs a little bit more strikes per minute at 3.46, just about the same, but he deflects only 42% of incoming strikes. And you know that saying where they say your defense is your offense, or you know, a good offense is a good defense, whatever the hell the saying is. The point is, that's kind of where Robert Whittaker shines. He's very evasive, and he's a very good defensive fighter. Now, I will also say statistically, on paper, it shows that Whittaker only lands about 4.6 significant strikes per minute, while Chimaev lands 5.72. But I want you to keep in mind, Whittaker has faced a lot tougher opponents and a lot more opponents than Chimaev. And I think that if Chimaev faces more guys and continues to face tougher competition, you'll see his average kind of normalize a little bit. So I don't think it's quite a fair comparison. And that's why I think that you have to really connect stats with context. And that's why I love doing that. And I love my channel because I focus on that. I show you guys the stats and I give you guys a bunch of context with it to help you guys understand the analysis of these fighters. So I'll continue my point here. The other thing that I want to mention about Whittaker's striking versus Chimaev's is that Whittaker's kind of known for his technical striking abilities, especially his jab and his combinations and the movement he does within the octagon. Now, Chimaev, his striking is still developing, and we've seen it improve over the course of his most recent fights and just, you know, his fights throughout his fighting career. But Robert Whittaker still takes the cake when it comes to striking in general, and I need that to be a point because the stats may not show you guys that. But let's talk about all the other things as well that are really leaning towards Whittaker's favor and that make him a really good underdog on this card. The first things that I want to talk about are cardio and pace. Now, Whittaker has proven his cardio over the course of 5 rounds many times. Now, Chimaev, he's kind of shown a little bit of fatigue when it comes to the later rounds in fights, and I think that you guys need to keep that in mind. I know there's a lot of hype behind Chimaev. I know he's making kind of a return after you know, being inactive for a little bit, so there's a lot of hype behind the guy, and I know he has the home crowd advantage of sorts, but keep in mind, when it comes to cardio and pace, Whittaker is king, especially in this matchup. So that paired with that striking technique is going to be absolutely pivotal. And now I also want to say Whittaker, he does have good wrestling, and I don't think that a lot of people discuss that enough, but he has decent wrestling and he also has decent takedown defense, and that could neutralize some of Chimaev's grappling attempts, and it could kind of force Chimaev to strike a little bit and potentially frustrate Chimaev. And if I'm being honest here, not to focus on this next point too hard, but Chimaev looks a little bit down, and what I mean by that is he just doesn't seem like his normal aggressive self. I think that he's in a different phase of his life. He's kind of found this inner peace of sorts, and that could affect his fighting style? Potentially. I don't want to focus on this point too much because I don't think there's much proof to this particular pudding, but it's something that I want you guys to know. It's not the same Chimaev that we've seen. He's a little bit different, and maybe that piece is good and maybe it's not. We'll find out. Now, again, I've talked about Whittaker's experience, so we're going to move past that point. Now, Whittaker, he's known for making really good in-fight adjustments. I've noticed that in quite a few of his fights. So if he could adapt throughout this fight and as the fight progresses, he could potentially outpoint Chimaev and kind of control him a little bit better, and at least to win some rounds, right? Now, one thing that Whitaker is really, really good at, especially when it comes to striking, is his counter striking. So if he could look to counter Chimaev's aggressive style, especially if Chimaev's a little bit tired, I think that that's going to work in Whitaker's favor big time. So this is kind of similar to the first fight we covered with Holloway, but Whitaker has to kind of weather that early storm because Chimaev's going to be coming at him like a train. And so, pause, but if he weathers that early storm, then he could have advantages in the later rounds. And so in the later rounds, I can expect Whitaker to kind of pressure Chimaev a little bit and force him to work at a very high rate and just continue to work at that high rate. And I think that that's where those cardio issues are really going to get exposed. And that's where Whitaker is going to shine because even in the 5th round, Whitaker looks great. Looks like he's just in the 2nd round. It's insane. So if he can exploit all those weaknesses, then you never know. Maybe he gets the late stoppage or something, or even gets the decision victory. And so just to recap real quick, if Whitaker can survive the early rounds and use his technical striking and experience and potentially take over the later rounds and kind of capitalize on Chimaev's cardio issues, then I think Whitaker has a really good chance here. And those are all things that he has done before. When I say if this fighter can do this, I'm not just saying by miracle if this guy's able to do this. I never mean it that way. What I mean is that this guy has been able to do this before. If he can do it in this fight again, then there's a really good case to be made here. So the next promising underdog that I want to really highlight for you guys is Bruno Ferreira. Now Bruno Ferreira, he's 3 years younger than his opponent here. He lands 2.11 more strikes per minute, and he has a 10% higher striking accuracy. Now all things considered, I give Bruno Ferreira a 45% probability of victory. And I think he's a good underdog feature here because Bruno Ferreira, he's won 12 fights. He's finished all of those. He's won 3 of his 4 UFC fights. So he's had 4 fights in the UFC. He's won 3 of those. Recently, though, if you zoom out a little bit, he's won 4 of his last 5 fights, and he's coming off of 2 back-to-back wins. And the last time this guy lost was also back in July of 2023, so it's been a while for him as well, and he's been active. Now, a 45% probability of victory for an underdog definitely positions Bruno Ferreira at a great spot for an underdog with a lot of potential and value. So let's talk about what he does very well. And the first thing I would say right off the bat is that he utilizes his knockout power very, very well. He's done a ton of knockouts and TKOs in his professional fighting career, and if he really leverages that explosive power like he has before, then he could potentially catch Magomedov early on. Now, what he'll have to do, and what he'll really have to focus in on and not be scared to do so, is closing the distance with Magomedov. Now, Magomedov, he has a big reach advantage in this fight, and so if he can get inside and kind of negate that advantage by pressuring Magomedov and fighting in that close range, then it would really work in his favor. Now, another thing that he'll have to do in order to try to do that is apply a lot of pressure towards him. And so what I've noticed about Ferreira is that he has a very aggressive fighting style. And so his ability to kind of push that pace potentially could overwhelm Magomedov, especially considering the early rounds of the fight. And so if he can look for that early finish, because remember, keep in mind, Ferreira's fights, they have not gone past like 6 minutes pretty much. And so if he can get that early finish here, then before cardio even becomes a factor or anything like that, then Magomedov might be kind of in a bad position. And so another thing that I really like about Ferreira is his hooks. I really like how he throws his hook. He relies on like these really big hooks as he's closing the distance, and that's very, very important when you consider his fighting style and what has been successful for him. And so if he lands those shots, he could hurt Magomedov as well. Now, one thing I really hope that he's focusing in on that I've noticed is that he has to kind of exploit Magomedov's defensive vulnerabilities. And what I mean by that is that I've noticed that Magomedov has shown a little bit of defensive lapses in some of his previous fights, especially when he's in moments of pressure or high intensity. And that's really where Ferreira shines, because if he can get him to those weird, uncomfortable positions, he could potentially get an opening for some of his powerful strikes. And so Ferreira, he's had a lot of experience with some of those taller types of opponents, and I think that that's going to help him try to execute this type of strategy. Now, Magomedov, he's not primarily a wrestler, but he has shown some wrestling skills in the past, and so Ferreira will have to be a little bit careful and keep that takedown defense pretty sharp in order to keep the fight standing where he can continue his pressure. He will have to be kind of careful early on in the fight as he's implementing this game plan. He's going to have to kind of survive Magomedov's early attacks and maybe some of those front kicks that are very vicious, and so that way he can then take the fight in control as it progresses. So some of the keys for Ferreira, just to recap: he has to close the distance, he has to avoid Magomedov's rangy attacks and close that distance, he has to land some of his own power shots and those hooks to look for an early finish before cardio becomes a huge factor in this fight. And he really has to lean in his aggressive style and his knockout power that gives him that puncher's chance. And if he does so, he has a decent chance of coming out with the victory and pulling off an upset here as an underdog. So the next promising underdog that I want to highlight for you all is Rafael Cerqueira. Now, Rafael Cerqueira, he has a height advantage of 1 inch in this matchup, and I ended up giving him a 52% probability of victory to win this fight. So he's an underdog that I am expecting to win logically. I like how he fights stylistically, and I like the momentum he's carrying so far, and we'll kind of dig deeper into that. Just to recap his record and give you guys some exposure to that, he's won 11 fights total. He's finished 91% of those. Now, he hasn't fought in the UFC before, so this is going to be an interesting debut, but of course he's on an 11 fight win streak, never lost before, so pretty interesting and good opportunity for the guy as well. I know sometimes guys will make their UFC debut and they end up disappointing, but I think Rafael will be... there's a good chance that Rafael is going to be a little bit different. So here's what I really like about Rafael. I really like the way he uses his speed and his movement in the cage. And so what I expect is that Rafael is actually going to be the faster fighter in this matchup. And what I expect him to do, and what I've seen from him, is that he's going to be able to slip some of Ibo's punches here and then look for openings for counter strikes. And the way he's going to do that is use the footwork that I've seen him use before and kind of create those angles that he's good at creating, and that could potentially set him up to avoid Aslan's power shots while he's landing his own. And that's something that I'm thinking will happen in this fight. I think he can kind of also exploit and lean into his cardio advantage a little bit. Now, there's questions going out there about Aslan's cardio overall. He's kind of tired, especially when you look at his last fight. He did not look too good. But if Rafael can kind of push that pace and drag the fight into the later rounds, then I think that he could be able to take over as Aslan continues to fatigue throughout the fight. And I know that both of these guys kind of prefer striking more than leading into takedowns, but I think that Rafael might also have a little bit of an advantage when it comes to taking the fight to the ground. I like the fact that he's trained with Jalton Almeida, and I think that his grappling is going to impress some people, especially as he continues to grow overall, because that's a really good... that's someone who's good to train with, is what I'm trying to say. Anyways, what he has to do in this fight is stay patient and stay technical. Now, Ibo, what you might notice is that guy kind of likes to brawl. He looks for like some big shots or maybe one big shot. And Rafael, he's a little bit more calculated if you look at his highlights and footage. And so if he stays a little bit disciplined and maybe avoids those wild exchanges, then he's not going to embarrass himself. Now, what he will have to do is target the body. I think that that's going to be very effective in slowing Aslan down and just kind of further, exploiting his questionable gas tank, especially looking at his past couple fights. It's been very questionable. But Rafael, I like his diverse striking, honestly. I like his kicks, and they could be extremely useful in this fight. So as long as he also weathers the storm early on, because keep in mind, Aslan is very dangerous in the early rounds, maybe round 1 and 2, with that knockout power. So if Rafael can kind of survive that first round, then I think his chances of winning will probably increase, and then he will turn into the favorite in the live betting odds. And so if he combines all those tactics and kind of avoids Aslan's power punches, I think he has a good chance of earning a victory here. I'm expecting him to win, and so I think he's a great underdog to highlight for you all. The next promising underdog that I want to highlight for you guys before I jump into inexpensive favorites and the bets that I really like for this card, it's going to be Bruno Silva. Now, Bruno Silva, he has a height advantage of 1 inch here. He lands 0.95 more strikes per minute, which is pretty much 1 more strike per minute. And he has a 3% higher takedown defense. All things considered, I gave Bruno Silva a 43% probability of victory, which does position him really well as an underdog that has a lot of potential here. Now, keep in mind, Bruno Silva, he's won 23 fights. He's finished 87% of those 23 fights. Now, he's had 9 fights within the UFC, of which he's won 4, and I will acknowledge that recently he hasn't had the best record. He's been struggling very recently, but I think he has a lot of intangibles that position him as a good underdog, and I'll review all of those right now with you guys. Starting with his knockout power, which he's proven in multiple fights. Keep in mind, a lot of his fights have been finished by KO/TKO, and so he's going to want to land those heavy strikes early and often in order to try to finish his opponent here. Now, what he has to do against Ismail is apply a lot of pressure and aggression. He's known for that very aggressive fighting style, and by pressuring Ismail here, he's not really going to allow him to utilize his range and technical striking skills. Now, Silva has to find open openings for those power shots, so it's kind of contingent upon that. But one thing that I think he can really target is Ismail's chin. Keep in mind, within the last 3 years, Ismail has lost twice via KO/TKO. One within the first round, and that was back in 2022, and the other time was back in 2021, where he lost in round 2 in a championship fight back at Brave CF. And this is a guy who was previously in the UFC, and now he's making a return to the UFC. And so that's not necessarily the best look to have, and I think that Rafael has a little bit of even a psychological advantage at that point. But back to the strategy here, Ismail, he's gonna rely on his range, and so Silva, what he needs to do is close that distance quickly and kind of negate some of Ismail's striking advantage here, and he has to capitalize on mistakes here, because what Ismail does sometimes is that he gets a little bit careless or reckless when it comes to striking, and that's where he gets caught. And so if Silva is a little bit patient and looks for those counter opportunities, and especially if Ismail ends up overextending, then what's going to end up happening is that Silva can catch Ismail on the chin and maybe drop him, if I'm being honest. Now, what I will say is that Silva is 35 years old. Please keep that in mind. And so he's going to have to work pretty hard to try to wear down the younger, I should say, Ismail in this fight. He also has to defend against takedowns, and Silva, he does have pretty good takedown defense overall, so I don't think that that's going to be a problem. But I think by preventing any kind of takedown attempts from Ismail, it's going to allow the fight to be standing. And so just to kind of recap, Silva, he is the underdog here, but with that knockout power and his experience that he has, I think that he does have some different paths to victories in this fight if he can execute his game plan pretty well. And I think that with me giving him a 43% probability of victory, that means that, you know, that's pretty close to that 50-50 mark. So I think that he does have some advantages here that give him some opportunity. So if you were already kind of leaning towards him and you thought that, you know, he could take on Ismail and defeat him, then take this as some confirmation that I also think that he is a good fighter and a good underdog with potential. All right, now we're going to switch gears, and now I'm going to talk about the promising favorites for this card, which I've chosen through 3 main criteria. First, they have a high statistical weighted confidence either through my prediction models or through fighter stat evaluation, or some combination of both. Second, their opponent does not have a high probability of victory, so you're not going to notice any overlap between the underdogs I just showed you earlier and these fighters. And the third thing is that their odds aren't too expensive. If a fighter has like -600 or -700 odds, they're obviously just too expensive to pick, but you could always parlay them if you want. In this video, I'm going to focus more on finding you guys some value rather than just stating some obvious picks and pointing out those -600 type fighters. So I consider these 3 things for you guys. I do all the work for you guys, and then I show you the valuable picks that fit that criteria. And if you want to know how I predict each fight plays out and the results, please check out my prediction breakdown from earlier this week, where I review stats, each fighter's fight history, the results of my 7 data science prediction models, my final picks, and the method of victory. Now for this portion of the video, for these favorites, I'm only going to review their stat differentials that they have against their opponent. But again, if you want those in-depth breakdowns, please refer to that video from earlier this week. It will help you out. So I'm just going to talk through these guys' statistical advantage here. If you want to know why they're likely to win and like an in-detail breakdown, please go to the video from earlier this week. And I go in serious depth with each of the fights. So anyways, first inexpensive and confident favorite that I want to highlight for you guys is Lerone Murphy. Now Murphy here, he has a height advantage of 2 inches. He has a reach advantage of 2 inches. He lands 1.31 more strikes per minute. He has a 9% higher striking accuracy. He absorbs 0.91 less strikes per minute. He has a 3% higher striking defense. He lands 0.6 more takedowns on average. He has a 26% higher takedown accuracy, and he lands 0.3 more submissions on average. Now, all things considered, statistical analysis, outside of stats, fight film studying, all of that, I ended up giving Murphy a 76% probability of victory. And I think that based on where he's at on the lines and that kind of probability of victory, I think he's positioned pretty good as a favorite to maybe parlay or sprinkle somewhere for a little bit of value. Now the next inexpensive and confident favorite that I want to highlight for you guys is Shara Magomedov. Now Shara is 3 years younger than his opponent here. He has a reach advantage of 2 inches. He lands 1.19 more strikes per minute. He has a 14% higher striking accuracy and a 40% higher takedown defense. This guy is a beast, and I know a lot of people don't necessarily believe in him, but I think that he has what it takes at least to climb a little bit further in the division division before he actually lands into some challenges and troubles. So I think he's going to be able to get this fight and get the job done, which is why at the end of the day, after looking at the statistical models and looking outside of stats and his previous fights as well, I ended up giving him a 69% probability of victory, and that does give his opponent a 31% probability of victory, which, I mean, sometimes in MMA that's all you need to end up winning, but logically Shar should get the job done, and I really like what he brings to the table as a fighter and his versatility as well. And of course, the guy has a lot of room to improve. I fully acknowledge that. I don't think he's perfect by any way, and that's me just being honest and transparent with you guys. But I do like what he brings to this matchup in this card. Now, the last inexpensive and confident variant that I want to bring to you guys before I jump into bets that I really like for this card, it's going to be McTyvek Oralby. Now, Oralby, he has a height advantage of 3 inches in this matchup. He's 5 years younger than his opponent. He has a reach advantage of 8 inches. He has a 4% higher striking accuracy. He absorbs 1.6 less strikes per minute than his opponent here. He lands 3.32 more takedowns on average, and he has a 17% higher takedown defense. Now, all things considered, when I look at the stats and outside the stats, I ended up giving McTyvek Oralby a 79% probability of victory. I really like where he's at as a fighter. This is an interesting card because it's one of those cards where there's a lot more underdogs with potential than there are favorites that are relatively inexpensive to capitalize on, which is good in a way because we get a lot more value and potential, better bang for our buck, and it allows us to roll the dice with more reward. But this is just the next confident favorite that I want to highlight for you guys. Unfortunately, I don't have 5 for this card. I only had 3, but regardless, I'm going to show you guys all the value that I potentially can for each and every single event. Now let's review the bets that I think have value for this card and have a good statistical and stylistic possibility of happening. Please disregard prop bets where you're picking the other fighter to win. I'll start from the top of the card and work my way down. You'll see that I've laid out a few options for you guys depending on how risk averse you are and how much risk you're willing to take. So starting from the top of the card, working my way down, let's start with our banger main event. We have Ilia Topuria versus Max Holloway. If you think Topuria is going to win, you could take him via decision. I think he has a better chance of securing the decision victory than getting the knockout, and I know you might be shocked by that, but the reason that's the case, in my opinion, is because of who Max Holloway is and the way he fights. I think it's very hard to put a stop to Max Holloway. Keep in mind, he's never been knocked out before. He's extremely durable, and that's been proven time and time again. And he's a great striker, great boxer, and he's also a great defensive striker. So he's very good defending himself and evading shots and kind of just fighting very rangy if you see the way he fights. So I think Topuria has a better chance of getting the decision victory. You might disagree, and that's fine. And he might even catch Holloway and get the knockout victory. It's MMA, anything could happen at any time. I'm just speaking out of logic. If you're leaning towards Holloway, you could take the Holloway decision. I think Topuria also is very durable, and it's going to be hard to catch him like that. So there's a chance that if you're leaning towards Holloway, the decision seems to be more logical than the knockout. Now, if you want to be a little bit more neutral, then other options that I really liked were the over 1.5 or over 2.5. And just in case you do think that one of these guys is going to put a stop to another, then what I did was I threw a neutral bet in there, which was the under 4.5. If you do think that one of them, no matter what, is going to get the stop, then a potential bet to consider is like that under 4.5 or maybe even under 3.5 if you think one of them could get it done relatively early in the fight. Anyways, moving on to the co-main event, we have Robert Whittaker versus Khamzat Chimaev. Now, if you're leaning towards Chimaev, the logical take would be a Chimaev submission. I don't think Chimaev could knock out Whittaker, if I'm being honest, especially considering Whittaker's like counter striking, his defensive abilities. It's going to be very hard to drop a guy like that unless you're very, very talented as a striker, you know. Anyways, you could also, if you're leaning towards Whittaker, which, I mean, there is a great chance that Whittaker could also win as the underdog. I think the obvious take would be Whittaker via KO/TKO, especially if the fight continues into the later rounds where Chimaev gets a little bit tired, a little bit sloppy with his defense. It's going to leave openings for Whittaker to take advantage. So, and if you want a little bit of a neutral bet, then what you could do is take the fight, not go in the distance. And again, if you want to roll the dice a little bit, you could take the under 4.5, 3.5, 2.5, 1.5, just depending on personal preference and when you think that the fight would end. Moving on, we have Murphy versus Dan Ige. Now, here I would take Murphy via decision. I think there's a great chance of that happening logically, stylistically, and statistically. You could also just take the fight over 1.5, 2.5, or go in the distance. If you do the over 1.5, that does give Dan a potential chance to, you know, take the fight, finish Murphy, because Dan's one of those guys where All respect to him. He's one of those guys where if he lands, you're pretty much dropping to the mat. If he lands one of his like classic power shots. So if you did want to play a neutral, which could be wise, you could do that. Moving on, we have Magomed Ankalaev versus Alexander Rakic. In retrospect, I could have included Alexander Rakic in my underdogs with a lot of potential. Rakic is a great fighter. Especially his leg kicks they're very vicious. Someone mentioned that in the comment section below, so shout out to that person. But Rakic is very talented. So here, I think Ankalaev has the best chance of getting the decision victory. So if you wanted to go for someone and the method of victory, Ankalaev decision would be the case. Otherwise, neutral takes would be the over 1.5, 2.5 distance. Moving on to Sharo Magomedov versus Armen Petrosyan. Again, Armen Petrosyan is one of those guys I could have mentioned as an underdog with a lot of potential, but I kind of liked focusing on Sharo Magomedov as a favorite that's relatively inexpensive more than focusing on Armen as an underdog. But anyways, I would consider taking Shara via decision. Shara's, I don't know if he could finish Armen Petrosyan necessarily, but he is extremely talented. So if you did want to play it a little bit more neutral, you could do the over 1.5, 2.5, or even the fight, perhaps go in the distance if you agree with the Magomedov decision, but kind of want to leave your options open for Petrosyan maybe getting a split decision victory, something of that nature. Anyways, moving on, we have Geoff Neal versus RDA, Rafael Dos Anjos legend. For that fight, honestly, it's kind of hard to tell because RDA does, pour it on, and sometimes taking him as the underdog isn't the best decision. So for that fight, I just really want to focus on the over 1.5. I think there's a really good chance of that happening. Moving on, we have Matus Rebecki versus Mkhitaryan Orolbai. In that fight, I really like taking Orolbai via decision. I think that's relatively obvious and logical. So moving on, we have Abus Magomedov versus Bruno Ferreira. That's an interesting one. If you're going for Ferreira, you could take Ferreira via KO/TKO. You could also take the fight not go in the distance, or if you want to kind of tighten it up and have a better bang for your buck, you could do the under 2.5. Moving on, we have Kennedy Nzechukwu. Wow, butchered that, but I'm not going to edit the video. Versus Chris Barnett. Now, I would take Kennedy via KO/TKO. I think there's a good chance of that. Now, in case you're one of those guys that really likes Chris Barnett and you want to play it a little bit emotional and just, you like the guy, you want him to win, you could also take Barnett via KO/TKO. Neutral bets would be not go in the distance. Both guys are very, very powerful. You could also take the under 2.5 and 1.5. Great chances of those happening. Moving on, we have Farid Basharat versus Victor Hugo. For that, I would honestly consider Basharat via decision, or if you want to play it safe, the over 1.5, 2.5, or even the fight going the distance is the way to go. Moving on, we have Ibo Aslan versus Rafael Cerqueira. For that fight, very interesting one. I think the obvious thing would be Aslan via KO/TKO, but there is some underdog chance there for Rafael if you want to entertain that. Otherwise, some neutral things that you could do that could position you well is the fight not go in the distance or under 2.5, 1.5. Both guys have finishing ability. Both guys have a lot to prove, and they're going to want to prove it. And last but not least, we have Ismail Nardi versus Bruno Silva. Here, I would consider Silva via decision, or if you're leaning towards Ismail, you could take Ismail via decision as well. Regardless, I think the over 1.5, 2.5, or even the fight go in the distance would be decent to consider as well. Keep in mind, this card starts very early, guys. I don't want you to miss it. I believe if you're in Central Time, the prelim should start at about 9 a.m. and if you're in Eastern Time, it should start at 8 a.m. for you. I don't want you guys to miss this pay-per-view. I'm very excited for it. Thank you guys so much for watching. Please spread the love, share this video, like it, help the algorithm understand that I make quality content and I put a lot of effort into this. I genuinely want to thank all you guys, each and every single one of you guys. It really means the world to me that I could talk about my passion and share my research for MMA, for UFC. It really means the world to me. And for those of you that are also passionate about it, you know what that means to have a community to talk about it too, which is why I encourage you guys to be a part of this community. Drop your comments, tell me what your opinions are on fights. Let's have a conversation about it. I try to reply to every single comments of mine, good or bad. I really appreciate all of you guys. Anyways, I hope you had a wonderful week leading up to this event. UFC is always the highlight of my week, and I hope that it really brings joy to you as well. Even when the fighters that you pick don't win, it's just the fact that we get to see martial arts at the scale that it is today and nowadays. It's so widespread. It's amazing if you're a fan of the sport itself. Anyways, hope you all have a wonderful Saturday tomorrow and have a great event, win big, and feel free to message me in the comment section or on Twitter, and I'll be happy to follow you back and keep the convo going. Thanks once again, and see you guys in the next one. And with that said, that wraps up this video. I really appreciate you all for watching and being so supportive as always. Please make sure to like and subscribe, and check out that Patreon if you want to support me through there as well. There's a $10 a month contribution tier and a $20 a month premium tier, which includes early results, picks, and bets, and also includes premium data, analysis, and stats as well. Your support helps keep me encouraged and motivated to continue running all of this data and analysis for you guys and providing you guys all these insights. So thank you once again, and as always, see you guys in the next one.